Hello, class. Welcome to REL 155, Early and Medieval Church History. This is our sixth lecture in seventh week. So we have this week, and I believe next week is there's a holiday, so I don't think there's class next week, but then we'll have class again week after that, and one more actual lecture before the final exam. So hopefully you'll be ready for that. I'm still in the process of grading the midterm tests. I hope to finish by the next week or so. If you do want to know your grade, you can mention that in the email, and I will let you know as soon as I can what your grade is. And also wanted to remind you of the field trip I'm planning for this Sunday at the Holy Virgin Mary Russian Orthodox Church, which is only about 2 miles away from campus. I gave you the address, I think, in the notes the last times. If you are interested in going and need or let me know in the email. And if you need the address or directions, also let me know. I can send those to you. Okay. Well, let's get started with the lecture for this week. Also, keep in mind the paper. If you have any further questions about the paper, let me know. Or if you would like me to send you the my suggestions or any of the instructions for its rating guide, let me know. I'll send those to you as well. So hopefully some of you at least will attempt the paper. I know not all of you are going to do it. And it is possible to pass the class if you don't do it, but it is good experience for to learn how to write papers. So hopefully at least a few of you or several of you will attempt that, and it does give you the best possible grades by doing that as well. So keep that in mind. Okay, so now we begin the lecture for this week, and we will continue with chapter 9 where we left off last week. We were talking about how Christianity spread in the early centuries into the eastern parts of the world, into even as far as China, as well as Africa and other parts of Asia. So we'll continue with Christianity along the Nile. While Nestorians ventured east, Miaphysite Christianity spread across Africa, moving west along the northern coast from the city of Alexandria and Roman Egypt and south along the Nile to the ancient kingdoms of Ethiopia and Nubia, which are modern southern Egypt and Sudan. Now, remember, Nestorians uh, followed the teachings of Nestorius, who saw Jesus having almost like two personalities that did not unite. And whereas Miaphysites, formerly known as Monophysites, but now some point out this technical distinction and claim that Miaphysite is a preferable term. So similar to the teachings of Eutyches that would emphasize Jesus' divine nature over his human nature, but essentially Jesus had just one nature and not two that were combined. So these were the Christians that did not agree with either the Third Council or the Fourth Council, or groups that broke away from the major church during that time. So we call them non-Chalcedonian. They do not agree with the teachings of the Fourth Council, the Council of Chalcedon. So these are the groups that spread and actually still exist today, as we'll see. Alexandria became the epicenter of African Christianity, and the Christian faith appears to have arrived there before the close of the first century. In the centuries to follow, Alexandria grew into an intellectual center, uh, producing a substantial library of New Testament manuscripts, as well as some of the finest theologians of the early era, such as Clement, Origen, Athanasius, and Cyril. North Africa was also home to Latin writers of the early church, including Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine, who were situated in Roman Carthage. which is modern Algeria and Tunisia. Early monasticism also developed in the deserts south of Alexandria. Before long, the Coptic Church, which is an independent expression of Christianity aligned with neither Rome nor Constantinople, established links with Ethiopia and Nubia. So um, now we do have these are branches of the what we call the Oriental Orthodox Church, including the Coptic or Egyptian and the Ethiopian. And you can find those churches around the LA area. Uh, I've been to the Ethiopian one before. I may go to the Coptic one sometime in the future. While Christianity may have first come to Ethiopia through the testimony of the eunuch described in the book of Acts, um, who heard from the preaching of a Christian named Philip, and he was an official of the queen of the Ethiopians. So it's possible that he spread the message when he went back to Ethiopia. But Ethiopia probably owes its lasting Christian heritage to a group of Phoenician Christians who were shipwrecked on a journey to India. Local inhabitants killed everyone aboard the ship except for two young boys, one of whom, named Frumentius, became the first bishop of Axum, the capital of the Ethiopian Empire. Frumentius first served as a tutor to the crown prince Izana, who reigned as the emperor of Axum from 320 to 356. Izana eventually converted to Christianity and made it the official religion of the kingdom by imperial decree. In time, Ethiopia grew into a thriving Christian civilization. Organized monasticism emerged around 480, and monks spread the Christian message across the Aksumite Empire, even reaching into Arabia and Yemen. A group of 9 missionaries carried the Christian faith into the Ethiopian heartland, eliminating pagan religion throughout the realm. Centuries later, Europeans were astonished by the number of churches and Christian religious institutions they found in Ethiopia. Over the last 1600 years, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which maintained its independence as Islam dominated the region in the 7th and 8th centuries, has become central to the Ethiopian identity. Ethiopian Christianity has a distinctly Semitic character, holding to several Jewish observances and even claiming to possess the Ark of the Covenant. That is, if you know the story of the early Israelites in the Pentateuch, when Moses delivered them out of Egypt and gave them God's law, part of the law was to build the tabernacle and also some items for sacrifices. So one of the important religious items was the Ark of the Covenant, which was seen as almost like maybe a footstool for God's throne, and they actually believed that God resided in the tabernacle or the temple, and the Ark was his special instrument, his special footstool, because he sat in heaven but his feet were on the earth on the Ark. So so the Ethiopians believed that the Ark was moved from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. There's some different stories or legends about how that happened. Today, Ethiopia can rightly claim to be among the oldest continuously Christian civilizations. The story of Christianity in Nubia is also fascinating. There may have been a Christian presence in Nubia as early as the 3rd century, but the first official record dates to the joint reign of the Byzantine emperors Justinian I and his wife Theodora, each of whom appointed their own respective mission to Nubia. While Justinian accepted the Chalcedonian Creed, Theodora did not. So she belonged more to the Miaphysites or the Oriental Orthodox beliefs. So after sending her own Miaphysite group to Nubia, Theodora arranged for her husband's Chalcedonian company to be detained in Egypt. By the time Justinian's crew could free itself, Theodora's commission had reached Nubia, and its king, Silko, had converted to Miaphysite Christianity. Thereafter, Nubia flourished as a Christian civilization, reaching its height in the 10th century before succumbing to Islamic conquest in the 15th century. Nevertheless, the legacy of Nubian Christianity lives on in Nubian culture. Let's look at lost worlds. As Christianity entered its golden age in Africa and Asia, a period of missionary expansion and intellectual innovation, a new power was rising in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. In 610, a little known Arab merchant retreated into the mountains for solitary prayer, and he emerged as the Prophet Muhammad, claiming to bear direct revelations from God. Within 200 years, the faith known as Islam had spread from its humble origins in Mecca throughout the known world. Lands that had for centuries been Christian, such as Syria, Palestine, North Africa, and Persia, found themselves under Islamic rule, and Muslim forces reached as far as Spain in the west and China in the east by the end of the 8th century. Today, we are accustomed to thinking of Egypt, Syria, Turkey, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran as Islamic states, but this was not always so. Nonetheless, by the end of the 14th century, Christianity had been driven to the brink of destruction in many places where it had once been the dominant faith, replaced by Islam. However, a remnant of the Christian faith has always survived, lying dormant, waiting for a new birth. Considering the growth of the church in places like China and Uganda, it appears that in the 21st century, Christianity is awakening once again in the countries of the sunrise, or these African and Asian countries that we mentioned. All right, so this was kind of a excursion or a detour. We had to go back to chapter 9 because, in my opinion, it would have been more difficult to understand until we got to a certain point in the class. But now we're picking back up where we left off with chapter 17, bending the necks of victors. This is about mission to the barbarians, or the Germanic tribes of Europe during the early and medieval periods. The forests of northern Europe were inhabited by barbarian tribes who sacrificed animals and worshipped nature spirits among the trees and beside the streams. Any missionary who ventured among them and hoped to convert them had to demonstrate the superior spiritual power of Christianity. The most famous incident tells of one 8th century missionary named Boniface, who marched into a shrine in Germany, which was the sacred forest of Thor, the Germanic god of thunder. So if you're familiar with the Marvel comics or movies, you might know of Thor as one of the Marvel characters. That's based on the gods of Norse mythology, or the Germanic barbarian peoples. We think of the Vikings, but also the Anglo-Saxons and other Germanic barbarians worship those gods. So this isn't just a story that Marvel made up, but this is based on the actual religious beliefs of these barbarian Germanic peoples. So Boniface took an axe to a massive oak, which was seen as a sacred tree. Just as he took the first stroke, a mighty wind from God toppled the tree. The pagans marveled and were converted to Christianity. So some missionaries have a term called power encounter, where they do something that demonstrates the superior spiritual power of the Christian God to the pagan gods or the gods of other peoples. This was an early example of that. Boniface used the wood to build a chapel. Incidents such as this made Europe Christian. The missionary monks overthrew barbarian magic by calling on superior powers. With a few miracles and victorious battles, the Germans were ready for Christian baptism. Christianity faced a new and enormous challenge when the German tribes swept across the Rhine and Danube frontier and left the once mighty empire of the Romans in disarray. The civilization that arose on those ruins was Christian in character because the invaders surrendered their gods. Why did the Germans come to worship the god of their defeated foes? Well, we hope to answer that question in the course of this chapter. We'll start with the coming of the barbarians. The year 476 is usually given to mark the end of the Christian Roman Empire in the West. That is the year the long line of emperors inaugurated by Augustus ended and the undisguised rule by German leaders began. The event itself was not spectacular, since the mercenary soldiers wielding the real power in the name of the emperor were mainly Germans who fought against the German barbarians. In 475, Orestes, the barbarian commander of the imperial troops, forced the Senate to elect his young son, Romulus Augustulus, as emperor in the West. In the following year, however, another Germanic commander named Odovacer slew Orestes and deposed Romulus Augustulus, proclaiming himself head of the government. No one was particularly shocked, as they had been a generation earlier with the invasion of the barbarian forces led by Alaric, Gaiseric, and Attila. The Romans had called the Germanic tribes barbarians because during early contact with the Romans, they spoke no Greek or Latin. For the most part, they were tribes from the north, originally in or near Scandinavia. Tribes called the Vandals, Franks, Angles, Saxons, Goths, Lombards, Burgundians, and others. When they started to cause problems for the Romans in the 3rd century, they were at a cultural stage midway between a pastoral and an agricultural economy. Cattle, rather than money, marked the wealthy among them. The Germans were notorious for drinking and gambling, though their courage, respect for women, and freedom from many Roman vices were praised. A favorite amusement was listening to the tribal bards recite ancient tales of heroes and gods. Again, that's the Norse gods, the gods like Thor, Odin, and Loki that you might have seen in the Marvel movies or stories. The Germans loved to fight. Every warlord had a company of warriors linked to their leader by a personal oath of loyalty. During the centuries that the Romans and Germans faced each other across the Rhine-Danube frontier, they had countless contacts with each other, peaceful as well as hostile. Roman trade reached into Germany, and Germans entered the empire as slaves. During the 3rd century, many barbarians were invited to settle on vacated lands within the empire or serve in the Roman legions. By the end of the 4th century, the Roman army in the West had become almost completely German. The crisis of mass invasions came with the sudden appearance of a new uncontrollable force, the Huns. Late in the 4th century, this force subjugated the easternmost Germanic tribe, the Ostrogoths, and the terrified Visigoth tribe petitioned the Romans to allow them to settle as allies inside the empire. Rome granted the request, but mistreatment of the Visigoth tribe later led them to go on a rampage, defeating the Roman army in the Battle of Adrianople, a decisive battle which destroyed the legend of the invincible Roman legions and led to a century and a half of chaos. For a few years, the emperor Theodosius I held back the Visigoths, but after his death in 395, they began to migrate and raid under their leader Alaric. he invaded Italy and his followers sacked Rome. To counter Alaric's threat to Italy, the Romans had withdrawn most of their troops from the Rhine frontier in 406 and from Britain the following year. The consequence of this action was a flood of Germanic tribes across the defenseless frontiers. The Vandals pushed their way through Gaul to Spain before moving to Africa. In 455, a Vandal raiding force sacked Rome a second time. Meanwhile, the Burgundians settled in the Rhone Valley, the Franks gradually spread across northern Gaul, and the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes invaded Britain. Each of these tribes set up a German-ruled kingdom within the confines of the empire, though only those of the Franks in Gaul and the Angles and Saxons in Britain lasted longer than a few centuries. Today, we see that the Germanic invasions were not as catastrophic as was once thought, as most of the land seized by the invaders was either vacant or belonged to the emperors. Few private landowners were displaced. A gradual blending of the cultures and blood of the two peoples began. In time, the barbarians lost their Germanic customs, religion, and speech. Let's look at missions to the north. The task of converting these northern peoples was enormous. Since they wanted to enter into the grandeur of Rome, they accepted a nominal adherence to Christianity, which they saw as the Roman religion. But it was much more difficult to educate them, teach them sufficiently the Christian faith, and instill in them Christian behavior. The barbarians were brought to Orthodox Christianity in two ways: directly from paganism and indirectly through Arianism. If you remember, that's the heresy that denied that Jesus Christ was the eternal Son of God. Arian teaching spread among them from the 4th century, the time when Arianism was strong in the empire. This Arianism, however, was more a matter of structure for them, as it did not have the ecclesiastical center of Rome. The German tribes were not as interested in the details of abstract theology. The Arian influence apparently began with missionary work among the Visigoths. A half century after the Council of Nicaea, a missionary named Ulfilas or Ulfila crossed the Danube to work among them for 40 years, leading them to faith in Christ, as Arius preached him. From the Goths, Arian Christianity spread to other Germanic tribes. Some of the earliest northern peoples to come to Christ were beyond the borders of the empire and were not themselves German. The Irish were a Celtic people, and their conversion is traced to Patrick early in the 5th century. Patrick had been taken captive during Irish raids in England. He later escaped, but a dream led him to return to Ireland to teach the Irish people about Christ. Patrick became a missionary to the people who had earlier enslaved him. A century later, the structure of the church in Ireland was predominantly monastic, as the monastic community that maintained itself on the land fit the agricultural communities of the Celts better than the parish church system common in the Roman Empire. Ireland then became the base for the evangelization of Britain. Just as the Irish were known for journeying from Ireland, the missionary monks traveled to spread the Christian faith. An Irish monk named Columba led in the founding of a monastery on Iona, an island off the coast of Scotland, which led to the preaching of Christ in Britain. Celtic monks from Ireland and Britain also became missionaries to the European continent. They established monasteries in Germany, Switzerland, and even northern Italy. These monasteries became centers of evangelization and learning. So we'll turn now to the gospel among the Franks. Roman Catholic influence began in the northern half of Gaul among the Franks, the tribe destined for greatness and shaping Christian Europe. The founder of the nation was Clovis, uh, who reigned from 481 to 511, who was the first barbarian chief of importance to convert to Orthodox Christianity as opposed to the Arian heresy. He was married to a Burgundian princess who was a Christian. His first son died after being baptized, and his second son fell sick after baptism, but recovered when the mother prayed. Then, in a battle, Clovis called upon Jesus at the point of nearly being defeated, and the king of the enemy tribe fled. He then persuaded his people to renounce their German gods. He and 3,000 of his army accepted Christian baptism. This first of many mass conversions during the Middle Ages raises important questions about the paganizing of Christianity. Missions can proceed in two ways. The first is through individual conversion with a period of instruction before baptism, which tends to uproot people from their own culture. The second is through mass conversion, the method that converted Europe. Kings like Clovis embraced the faith, and their people followed them into Christianity, which did not uproot individuals from their culture, but also meant the converts brought their superstitions and behavior into the church. So this is known as a people movement. So this is evident in many cases, starting with Clovis himself, who saw Jesus as a tribal war god and admired militant religion and saints who were military figures. The saints may well have meant more to the people than Christ himself, and they saw various saints as performing specific assignments, such as taking care of pigs or curing toothaches. The Germans could find a saint for almost every human need. Many tales circulated about the miraculous powers of the saints. The story is told of two beggars, one lame and the other blind, who were fearful of being cured when caught in a procession carrying the relics of a saint, since they did not want to be deprived of their livelihood of begging alms. And they begged alms on the basis of being blind and lame, and so they actually did not want to be cured. So they hurried to get away from the saints' miraculous powers, but they failed, and they were actually cured, according to the story. All right, let's look at passage to England. In spite of the shallow impact of the gospel among the Franks, their conversion did provide a passage through Gaul to Great Britain. The initiative for the conversion of the English came from Rome, as Pope Gregory the Great in 596 sent a party of Benedictine monks to the distant and barbaric land of England under the leadership of St. Augustine of Canterbury. That's a different person from the more famous Augustine of Hippo we talked about, so don't confuse them. There were two Augustines that we've talked about. So Augustine and his monks began their ministry in Kent, one of the areas controlled by the Anglo-Saxons, who had invaded and conquered much of England. Augustine met with King Ethelbert, who granted land for the foundation of a monastery at Canterbury, which ever since has been the headquarters of the English religious leader. Canterbury is known as the sort of the center or the main church or cathedral of the Church of England. Gregory appointed Augustine the first Archbishop of Canterbury. So at that time, of course, the archbishops were Catholic, but now they are Anglican, or they belong to the Church of England. If you take the class in modern church history, I hope to teach in the future, then you'll learn how all that came about. All right, the missionaries who followed Augustine, worked farther north. By the time of King Oswy in the late 7th century, the two missionary movements, the Celtic followers of Columba working toward the south, and the followers of Augustine working toward the north, connected. However, Oswy followed the northern Celtic form of Christianity, while his wife followed the Roman practices, leading to disputes about matters such as the date of Easter. At the Synod of Whitby in 664, Oswy brought the matter to a decision. The Celtic advocate appealed to the authority of Columba, while the Romans appealed to that of Peter, arguing that Christ had given Peter the keys of heaven. Impressed by such an important figure as the doorkeeper of heaven, Oswy agreed to follow the Roman practices, and the British Isles moved under the authority of the Roman Church. After being rooted in Anglo-Saxon England, Christianity returned to the continent with fresh vigor, with British missionaries such as Winfrid or Boniface, who was commissioned by Pope Gregory II in 729 to evangelize Germany. He had great success in his primary task of converting the pagan population, while also bringing the British and Irish missionaries or missionary monks into closer relationship with the Bishop of Rome. Boniface was deeply devoted to the cause. Not only could he chop down a sacred tree while the multitude watched, expecting him to be struck dead, in other words, they expected the power of Thor, the god they believed in, to strike him for cutting down the sacred tree. But when that did not happen, he demonstrated the superiority of the Christian God. So he did that, but he could also win the masses to the Christian faith and organize the districts, and as in his authority to form a church structure bound to the central authority of Rome. Boniface became Archbishop of Mainz, yet he desired to return to his earlier efforts in the still pagan Frisia, now known as the Netherlands, where he met the fate of martyrdom. In other words, he was killed for his faith, or probably killed by those he was trying to preach to. All right, now we turn to part 4 of the book, which is about the Christian Middle Ages. And this is as far as we're going to get uh, as this time period from 590 to 1517. Europe owes much to the Christian faith. When the barbarians destroyed the Roman Empire in the West, it was the Christian church that put together a new order called Europe. The church took the lead in rule by law, the pursuit of knowledge, and the expressions of culture. The underlying concept was Christendom, which united culture and church. It began under Charlemagne in the 8th century, but the popes slowly assumed more and more power until they were thought of as world rulers. Later centuries, however, saw the popes corrupted by power, and reformers cried for change. So that's as far as we're going to get in this class over the next few weeks. Some of the early reformers before Martin Luther. All right, let's turn now to chapter 18, God's Counsel, which is about Gregory the Great. Early in 590, Rome, after having faced the tragedies of floods and the hardships of war, was struck with the spread of the plague. Men, women, and children died quickly with black eruptions after initially only experiencing a sore throat. Carts were piled high with corpses. People went insane, and even the Pope died in agony. For 6 months, no Pope ruled. When church leaders decided to elect a monk named Gregory, he refused the office and fled from the city until he was found and brought back to Rome, where he was consecrated as the new Pope. Gregory was a most unlikely candidate for greatness. He was older, frail, and had no desire for the papal office. Yet he began his administration with a public act of humiliation because the plague had taken the life of his predecessor. Processions filed through the streets for days, saying prayers and singing hymns. The plague initially continued to ravage the city, but it finally subsided. A later legend credited Gregory's action with the end of the plague and told of the appearance of the archangel Michael putting his drawn sword in its sheath over the mausoleum of the Emperor Hadrian, later called the Castle of St. Angelo. Rome was a symbol of the continent. What we now call Europe arose from the ruins of the devastated empire, and it was Christianity that brought life and order out of the chaos. Let's look at Gregory's place in history. The church enlisted the Celtic and Benedictine monks to serve as a spiritual force for winning the barbarians to the Christian faith. It turned to the papal office to provide some stable structure for a new way of life and sought a framework of meaning from Augustine's theology. In his writing, Gregory stressed that the spiritual leaders should never be so absorbed in external cares as to forget the inner life of the soul, nor neglect external things and the care for his inner life. His words were autobiographical, describing his own life. When he died in 604, he was proclaimed God's consul or ambassador. This was an appropriate description of the man who strived to live for God while ruling the church and world like a Roman political leader. Not long after his death, the churches came to speak of him as Gregory the Great, and his name was included in the list of Latin fathers of the church. His greatness was due to his ability to combine great executive ability with warm sympathy for human need. All right, let's pause here for a minute. We'll continue shortly.